The plan, hastily established, was for 8 rangers to charge the 4 Comanche braves, mainly to distract them. Dietz was to watch the spare horses. Call and Augustus dismounted and crawled to within 100 yards of the camp while the Comanches argued about the woman. When the young brave raised his knife to the woman, Augustus shot him. When the boy got up, he shot him a second time. Call shot the 2 braves standing by the weapons. One he had to shoot 3 times. By this time, the racing rangers were almost in the camp, led by Teddy Beatty. Several of them shot at the large warrior who mounted and was about to escape, but it was a snapshot from Gus McCrae that killed him. Call hurried down into the camp and made sure that all 4 Comanches were dead. Most of the men, Augustus included, were stunned to find that the battle was over so quickly. "They're dead, Woodrow, they're dead," Augustus assured him. All of them were surprised that the victory had been so easy. "I guess we'll be promoted when we get home," Gus said, reloading his rifle. "There ain't nothing to promote us to. We're already captains," Call reminded him. "If that ain't high enough for you, then I guess you'll just have to run for governor." "He'd never get elected. He's done too much whoring," Long Bill said. Gus knelt by the young Indian boy to see where he had hit him. Dietz came up leading the extra horses and went to help the 2 children. Call pulled a slicker off his saddle and gave it to the woman, who was almost naked. She took the slicker but didn't say thank you and didn't look at them. She was staring away. Of course, he realized she had been only a moment from death. Perhaps she couldn't yet comprehend that she was saved. Perhaps in her blind stare she still saw the knife poised above her. "You're saved, ma'am. We got here just in time," Call said, before backing away. He didn't think it wise to say more, or to try and rush the woman back from the place she had gone in her mind. It was a place she had had to go to survive, as much as she had survived, he felt sure. If she was let alone, she might come back, although he realized there was a chance she wouldn't come back. What was sure was that the men who would have killed her were dead. "You made a fine shot to keep that young one from killing her. He was ready," Call said to Gus. "They're all 4 dead, and we got the woman and the children back, and some horses besides. We've been fair captains so far." Augustus was thinking how quick it had been, a few seconds of action and 4 men dead. Dietz was talking to the 2 children, while the other rangers milled. Neely Dickens was becoming more and more exhilarated by the knowledge that he was alive. Long Bill busied himself counting the horses they had recovered, 14 in all. "I guess we won't starve now, boys, even if we get plumb lost," he said. "We got horse meat now, horse meat on the hoof." P.I. had charged down on the Indians with the rest of the men, but had not fired his gun. He thought he would be unlikely to hit anybody while running at such a speed. P.I. had heard so many tales about how devilishly accurate Indians were with tomahawks and clubs that he had kept as low on his horse's neck as possible as he raced, hoping to avoid the tomahawks and maybe the arrows too. But then it turned out they were charging only 4 men, all of whom were dead by the time he reached the camp. Only one of the men had a tomahawk, and the rifles they were equipped with looked older and less reliable even than his own. P.I. went over to hold the horses while Dietz tended to the frightened children. He felt weak, so weak that he thought he might have to sit down. Even so, he did better than Neely Dickens, who passed through his phase of exhilaration, grew weak suddenly, and fainted. Neely flopped down as if dead, but since none of the Comanches had so much as fired a gun, no one supposed Neely to be dead. Teddy Beatty fanned him with a hat a few times and then paid him no more attention. "He ain't hurt, the little rascal," Teddy said. "Let him nap, I say." Call noticed that the woman had a lot of blood on her legs. The traveling must have been rough. "We need to go," he said to Augustus. "These 4 are dead, but there could be 40 more not far away." "Or 400 more, how would that be?" Augustus said. The fight had left him feeling a little distanced from himself. All the men seemed to feel that way, even Call. But it wasn't a condition they could afford to indulge, not with Buffalo Hump's camp just to the north. "Do we bury them, Woodrow?" he asked, nodding toward the dead warriors. It was a question Call had not had to consider before. There were 4 dead Comanches. Did they bury them or leave them as they had fallen? "I'm told the Comanches bury their own," he said, uncertain as to what was right in such a case. "I expect they would if they were here," Gus said, "but these men are dead. They can't bury themselves, and I expect they'll be bad torn up by the time a Comanche finds them." I'm worried about that woman, Call said. I think she's about lost her mind. Dietz boiled a little coffee over the Comanche campfire and fed the children a little bacon. The woman would take none. The men dug a grave and put the 4 dead warriors in it. While they were filling it in, the woman began to shriek. "He won't want me! I can't go home!" she shrieked. Then she ran away, out onto the prairie, shrieking as she ran. "I was afraid of this," Call said. The children were crying, though Dietz tried to shush them. The men all stood, numb and confused, listening to the woman scream. Augustus mounted his horse. "I'll get her," he said. He touched his horse with the spur and went loping after the woman. "I was afraid of this," Call said again, looking at the stunned men. Maudie Clark ran away several times a day, every day, of the 2 weeks it took the Rangers to reach Austin. Another sleet storm delayed them, and then heavy rains, which made the rivers high and treacherous. 3 horses bogged in the swollen Red River and drowned. Still, whatever the weather, Maudie Clark ran away. Once caught, she was docile. She seemed to mind Dietz less than the other men, so Dietz was assigned the task of seeing that she didn't escape or hurt herself. It was Dietz, too, who cared for her children. She seemed not to recognize them as her children now. "Something's broke in her, Woodrow," Gus said. "She won't even help her own young'uns anymore." All the men were careful not to let Mrs. Clark snatch a knife or a gun. Call instructed them to be especially watchful. He did not want the woman to grab a weapon and kill herself. "Bodies can heal. I expect minds can too," he said. At night they had taken to tying Maudie's ankles with a soft cotton rope, hobbling her like a horse. "If I were to break my whiskey jug, I expect I could glue it so it would look like a fine jug," Augustus replied, "but it would still be leaky and let the whiskey run out. That's the way it is with her, Woodrow. They might get her back in church and sing hymns at her till she stops screaming them screams, but she'll always be leaky. She won't never be right." "I can't judge it," Call said. "It's our job to bring her home. Then the doctors can judge it." Finally they breasted all the rivers and came to the limestone country west of Austin. "We're coming back with a passel of extra horses," Longbill pointed out. "I expect we'll be heroes to the crowd." Just then Maudie Clark started screaming. She ran right through the campfire. Neely Dickens made a grab for her but missed. Dietz, who had been cooking, got up without a word and followed her into the darkness. "Hurry up, Dietz, there's bluffs out here she might fall off of," Augustus said. "I don't know how anybody could feel like a hero with that poor woman running around out of her mind," Call said. "Well, but she might have been dead," Longbill said. "That brave had a knife at her throat." "She might prefer to be dead," Call replied. "I expect she would prefer it." Just then Dietz came back, leading Maudie, talking to her softly. All the men became silent. The woman's despair dampened all their moods. They had not even had a lively card game on the trip south. "I'm longing to see my Clara," Augustus said. They were in country that was familiar, where they had patrolled often. The familiar hills and streams made him think of his many picnics with Clara, the laughter and the kissing he had enjoyed throughout his long courtship. Surely, now that he'd been promoted to captain, Clara wouldn't make him wait any longer. Surely she would marry him now. "I hope we can find this woman's husband," Call said. "You better hope he'll take her back while you're hoping," Gus said. "That's right, Woodrow," Longbill said. "Some men won't have their wives back once they've been with the Comanches." "That's wrong," Call said. "It wasn't her fault she got taken. He oughtn't to have gone off and left her unguarded." "Sing to us, Dietz," Augustus said. "It's too boresome at night without no singing." Dietz had been singing to the 2 little children at night to quiet them and put them to sleep. Without his singing, they grew restless and fearful. Their mother rarely came near them now. Dietz had a low, soothing voice and knew many melodies, hymns mostly, and a few songs of the field. It was not only the children that were soothed by his singing. Long Bill was able to accompany Dietz on his harmonica most of the time. Though the men were calmed by the singing, Call wasn't. Usually, after listening a few minutes, he took his rifle and went off to stand guard. What rested him after a day of contending with the circumstances of travel, the girth on the pack mule might break, or they might strike a creek that looked dangerous to cross, was to be by himself 100 yards or so from camp. Whereas guard duty seemed to make most of the rangers sleepy, there being nothing to do but sit and stare, it made Call feel at his most alert. He had a keen ear for night sounds, the rustling of varmints, the cries of owls and bull-bats, deer nibbling leaves, the death squeak of a rabbit when a coyote or bobcat caught it. He listened for variations in the regular sounds, variations that could mean Indians were near, or if not Indians, then some rarely encountered animal, like a bear. Often he would sit all night at his guard post, refusing to change guards even when it was time. From time to time in the night, Maudie Clark shrieked. Just 2 or 3 shrieks, sounds that seemed to be jerked out of her. Call wondered if it might be dreams that called up the shrieks. He doubted the poor woman would live long enough for the violent memories to fade. When he came back to camp a little before dawn, only Dietz and Maudie were awake. The woman was fiddling with the buttons of an old shirt Long Bill had given her. She looked wild in her eyes, as if she might be getting ready to make one of her dashes out of camp. There was gray mist rising, making it hard to see more than a few feet. If the woman got away with it so foggy, there might be a long delay while they located her. Dietz anticipated the very thing that Call feared. "Don't you be running now, ma'am," he said. "You get thorns in your feet if you do, prickly pear all over the ground. You be picking them little fine stickers out all day if you go running off now." She had untied the cotton rope that he bound her ankles with. Gently, Dietz retied it, and Maudie Clark made no protest. "Just till breakfast," Dietz assured her. "Then I'll let you go." They brought the horses and the rescued captives into Austin on a fine, sunny morning. Nothing prompted a crowd like the Rangers' return, whether they'd been patrolling north or south. Folks that had been dawdling in stores came into the street to ask questions. The blacksmith neglected his tasks until he heard the report. The barber left customers half-shaven. The dentist ceased pulling teeth. Somebody ran to alert the governor and the legislators, though most of the latter were drunk or in bordellos and thus not easily rounded up. The first thing everybody noticed was that no short man on a big horse was leading the troop back home. Where was the great Captain Skull? "Tracking a horse thief, that's where," Augustus said, a little annoyed that most of the questions were about the captain, who had cavalierly deserted them while they were doing brave work. Gus saw Jake Spoon lurking over by the blacksmith's and waved at him to come help with the horses. He was anxious to get onto a bar room and sample some whiskey quick. "Don't get too drunk," Call said when he saw where Gus was heading. "The governor will be wanting a report." "Well, you report," Augustus said. "If the both of us go, we'll just confuse the old fool." "We're both captains, we should both go," Call insisted. "I despise governors, and besides, I need to see my girl before I get into business like that," Gus said. One of the reasons he was feeling a little grim was that there was as yet no sign of Clara. Usually, when he rode in with the boys, she came running out of the store to give him a big kiss. It was something he would begin to look forward to while still 50 miles away. But today, though the street was thronged, there was no Clara. Call spotted Maggie watching their return from a discreet spot in the shade of a building. He nodded and tipped his hat to her, an act that didn't escape the attention of Augustus McCrae. The other Rangers had just penned the horses. Long Bill Coleman immediately headed for a saloon to fortify himself a little before heading home to Pearl, his large, enthusiastic wife. "This is a damn disgrace," Augustus muttered. "Your girl's here to smile at you, and Billy has Pearl to go home to, but Clara's lagging if she's home." "I expect she's just running errands," Call said. "It's a passel of work running a store that size." Augustus, though, was growing steadily more annoyed and also more agitated. In his mind, Clara's absence could mean only one of two things. She had died or else she'd married. What if the big horse trader Bob Allen had showed up while he was away? What if Clara had lost her head and married the man? The thought disturbed him so that he turned his horse and went full tilt back up the street toward the Forsythe store, almost colliding with a buggy as he raced. He jumped off his horse, not even bothering to hitch him, and plunged into the store, only to see old Mr. Forsythe, Clara's father, unpacking a box of women's shoes. "Hello, Clara ain't sick, is she?" he asked at once. Mr. Forsythe was startled by Augustus's sudden appearance. "Oh, Clara, I'm trying to count these shoes and see that they're properly paired up," the old man said, a little nervously, it seemed to Gus. Normally, George Forsythe was loquacious to a fault. He would pat Gus's shoulder and talk his arm off about any number of topics that held no interest for him. But this morning he seemed annoyed by Gus's question. "Sorry to disturb you. I just wondered if Clara was sick. I had the fear that she might have taken ill while we were gone," Gus said. "Oh, no, Clara's healthy as a horse," Mr. Forsythe said. "Clara's never been sick a day in her life." "Where is she, then, you old fool?" Gus thought, but he held his tongue. "Is she out? I'd like to greet her," he said. "We traveled nearly to the North Pole and back since I was here." "No, she's not here," Mr. Forsythe said, glancing at the back of the store, as if he feared Clara might pop out from behind a pile of dry goods. Then he went back to counting shoes. Augustus was taken aback. Mr. Forsythe had always been friendly to him and had seemed to encourage his suit. Why was he so standoffish suddenly? "I expect she's just making deliveries," Gus said. "I hope you'll tell her I stopped in." "Yes, sir, I'll tell her," Mr. Forsythe said. Augustus turned toward the door, feeling close to panic. What could have happened to make George Forsythe so close-mouthed with him? Then, just as Gus was about to go out the door, Mr. Forsythe put down a pair of shoes and turned to him with a question. "Lose any men this trip?" he asked. "Just Jimmy Watson," Gus said. "Jimmy had fatal bad luck. We brought back 3 captives, though. One of them's a woman who's out of her mind." Jake Spoon was waiting in the street, eager to tag along with him like a puppy dog, but Augustus was in no mood to be tagged, not then. "Hello, Mr. McCrae. Did you kill any Indians?" Jake asked, an eager look on his young face. 2. Now, don't tag me, Jake. I have to report to the governor," Gus said. "Neely will tell you all about the Indian fighting." "Oh," Jake said, his face falling. Mr. McCrae had always been friendly with him. Never before had he been so brusque. Augustus felt guilty for being short with young Jake, but the fact was he could think of nothing but Clara, not at the moment. They'd been gone for weeks. Perhaps she had married. The thought stirred his mind to such a frenzy that the last thing he needed was to have to be gabbing about rangering with a green boy. "Woodrow Call and me got made captains," he said, trying to soothe the boy's feelings a little. "Being a captain is just one duty after another, which is why I have to go see the governor right now. He wants a report." "Yes, we all want one," Jake said. "You may want it, but he's the governor and you ain't," Gus said as he prepared to mount. His mind was in such an agitated state that, as young Jake watched in astonishment, he put the wrong foot in the stirrup and mounted the horse facing backward. It was only when Gus leaned forward to pick up his bridle reins and saw that in fact he was looking at his horse's rump that he realized what he had done. To make matters worse, most of the rangers, having stabled their horses, were walking toward the saloon to join Long Bill and saw him do it. They immediately started laughing and pointing, assuming Gus was so happy to be home that he had decided to ride his horse backward as some sort of prank. Augustus was so stunned by what he had done that for a moment he was paralyzed. "Well, I swear," he said, unable to believe that he had accidentally done such an absurd thing. He was about to swing down and try to pretend it only had been a prank when he happened to look up the road that led into Austin down a long slope. There was a buggy coming, a buggy with 2 people in it. It seemed to him that the 2 people were holding hands, though he couldn't be sure. The woman in the buggy was Clara Forsythe, and the man looked from a distance like Bob Allen, the Nebraska horse trader. One look was all it took to propel Gus off the horse. He didn't intend to be sitting in front of the Forsythe store looking backward off a horse when Clara arrived with Big Dumb Bob. He swung to the ground so quickly that he almost kicked young Jake Spoon in the face with his boot. "Go put this horse in the stable," he said, handing Jake the reins. "If Captain Call needs me, tell him I'll be in the saloon, and if he wants me to visit that governor, he better come quick." "Why, are you leaving again?" Jake asked, surprised. "That's right, leaving. I'll be departing from my right mind," Augustus told him. Then he hurried across the street and strode into the saloon so fast that he almost knocked over a customer who stood a little too close to the swinging door. "Why, hello, Captain," Long Bill said when Gus burst in and strode to the bar. Without a word to anyone, including the bartender, Augustus reached for a full bottle of whiskey and immediately yanked out the cork. Then he threw his hat at the hat rack but missed. His hat landed behind the bar. "Don't call me Captain, I'm plain Gus McCrae," he said. He raised the whiskey bottle to his mouth and, to the astonishment of the patrons, drank nearly a third of it straight off. Long Bill, perceiving that his old compañero, now his captain, was a little disturbed, said nothing. In times of disturbance, silence seemed to him the best policy. The other rangers began to file into the saloon just then, all of them eager to wet their whistles. "You better grab your liquor if you want any, boys," Long Bill said. "Gus means to drink the place dry, and he's off to a fine start." Augustus ignored the tedious palaver that ensued. All he could think about was Clara. He had by then convinced himself that she had unquestionably been holding hands with dull Bob. Instead of getting the homecoming kiss he had yearned for several days, what did he see but the love of his life holding hands with another man? No disappointment had ever been as keen. It was worse than disappointment. It was agony, and all he could do was dull it a little with the whiskey. He took another long draw, scarcely feeling the fire of the liquor in his belly. Quietly, the rangers took their seats. Quietly, they ordered their own drinks. "Gus, why did you get on your horse backward?" Neely Dickens asked. "Did you just happen to put your off foot in the stirrup, or what?" Augustus ignored the question. He decided to refuse all discussion of the horse incident or anything. The boys, Neely especially, would have to make of it what they could. "It's bad table manners to drink out of the bottle," Neely observed. "The polite thing is to drink out of a glass." Long Bill could scarcely believe his ears. Why would Neely Dickens care what Gus drank out of, and even if he did care, why bring it up when Gus was clearly more than drunk? "Now, Neely, I've seen men drink liquor out of saucers. There ain't just one right way," he said, nervous about what Augustus might do. "I would not be caught dead drinking no whiskey out of a saucer," Neely said firmly. "Coffee I might drink out of a saucer if it was too hot to sip from a cup." Augustus got up, went behind the bar, took the largest glass he could find back to his table, filled the glass, and drank it. "Does that suit you?" he asked, looking at Neely. "Yes, but you never told me why you got on your horse backward," Neely said. "I don't sleep good when people won't answer my questions." Just then Call stepped into the saloon. He saw that the whiskey bottle in front of him was half empty. "Let's go before you get any drunker," he said. "The governor sent his buggy for us." "I see," Augustus said. "Did the buggy just come by itself, or is somebody driving it?" "His man Bingham is driving it," Call said. "Bingham always drives it. Hurry up." "I wish you'd just let me be, Woodrow," Augustus said. "I ain't in the mood for a governor today, even if he did send Bingham to fetch us." Bingham was a very large black man who rarely spoke. He saw to it that the governor came to no bodily harm. "Your mood don't matter," Call said. "We're captains now, and we're due at the governor's." "Captaining's the wrong business for me, I expect," Augustus said. "I think I'll resign right now." "What?" Call said. "You've been talking about being a captain for years. Why would you resign now?" Without a word, Augustus corked the whiskey bottle, retrieved his hat, and went outside. "I may resign, and I may not," he said. The buggy he had seen Clara riding in was parked by the Forsythe store with no one in it, and the governor's buggy with Bingham in it stood beside it. "Dern, Bingham, you're nearly as wide as this buggy," Augustus observed. "The man who rides behind you won't have much of a view." "No, sir," Bingham said. "Mostly get a view of me." "I'm surprised you drink like that before you say hello to Clara," Call said. "Why would I say hello to her?" Gus asked. "I saw her taking a buggy ride with that dumb horse trader." "No, she wasn't. That was her uncle," Call told him. "Her ma's poorly and he's come for a visit." Augustus, who had just climbed in the buggy, was so startled he nearly fell out. It had not occurred to him that Clara could be with a relative when he saw her come down the hill. "Oh, Lord! You mean she's in the store?" he asked. "Why, yes, I suppose so," Call said. "Were you so drunk you got on your horse backward? That's what the boys are saying." Augustus ignored the inquiry. "Hold this buggy, Bingham," he demanded. "I've got to pay a short visit. Then I'll report to the governor until he's sick of listening." "But the governor's waiting," Call protested. "It don't take long to kiss a girl," Gus said, jumping out of the buggy and running into the store. Clara had her back to him when he rushed in. He had her in his arms before she even got a good look at him. But the color came up in her cheeks and the happy light into her eyes. "Why, it's my ranger," she said, and gave him the kiss he had been yearning for. "Yep, I'm a captain now, Clara. Woodrow's one, too. We're off to see the governor on urgent business." "The governor? My goodness," Clara said. "Yes, and I have to hurry or Bingham might lose his job," Gus said. "The governor expects us to report." Clara didn't try to stop him, but she followed him out the door and watched him as he vaulted into the governor's buggy and straightened his hat. Clara felt an old confusion, the feeling that had so often filled her when Gus came, relief that he was safe, excitement when he kissed her, joy that he still rushed in to see her first, disappointment that he left before she could even take a good look at him. Just a kiss and then he's gone. That's my ranger, she thought. Just a kiss and then he's gone. Governor E.M. Pease, whose campaign slogan had been Peace and Prosperity, did not like surprises. With surprises came disorder, and he hated disorder. His firm belief was that good administration, like human happiness itself, depended on planning that was careful, intelligent, and firm. Of course, as an experienced man, he had long since been forced to recognize that life, like the state of Texas, was never going to be perfectly manageable despite the most thorough planning. People dropped dead, fires broke out, storms flooded the land, foolish marriages were made, and the criminal element would never be entirely subdued or eliminated. Nonetheless, the duty of honest men and competent state officials was to plan and plan seriously so as to keep the element of surprise to a workable minimum. Now 2 dusty young rangers stood in his office with news that he found to be nearly incredible. Inish Skull, the brilliant hero of the Mexican War, the most experienced military man in the state, had left his command and walked away on foot, merely to reclaim a stolen horse. The governor had a map of the western region spread out on his desk and was attempting to get the young rangers to pinpoint the area where Captain Skull had left the troop, but it was fast becoming apparent to him that they couldn't. "We were east of the Pecos and some ways north of the Red River," Call said. "Way north of the Red," Augusta said. "We were several days getting down to the Red." The governor, whose spectacles had been unaccountably mislaid, had to squint to make out many details. But when he did squint, he discovered what he already suspected, which was that there was no way of deducing where Inish Skull might be. "Why, there's nothing there, not even a creek," the governor said. "Inish has lost himself, and over a goddamn horse." "Well, it was his war horse, Governor," Gus remarked. "He held that horse in high regard." "Yes, and what about his duty to the state of Texas?" Governor Pease said. "Did he hold that in high regard, sir?" Call and Gus had no idea what to say. They had never met a governor before. Call thought they ought to talk as little as possible, but Augustus, as usual, found it hard to keep quiet. "He made us both captains before he went," he said. "I guess he thought we could get the boys home safe. And we done it, and recovered those captives, too." "Yes, though I doubt the woman will recover. They rarely do," the governor said. "I'll endorse your promotions. The state can use a pair of competent young captains like yourselves. What stumps me is Inish. How did he expect to catch up with Kicking Wolf on foot when he'd already failed to catch him horseback?" The governor went to the window and looked out. Far to the west, huge white thunderheads floated like warships across a blue sky. "Inish Skull is a rich man," he said. "He's always been a rich man. He could buy and sell me 10 times over, and I'm no pauper. He don't need the job. He was only rangerin' because it interested him, and now it's stopped interesting him, I guess. So away he went," he added, turning back to the young men. "Away he went. He might be off to California to prospect for gold, for all we know. Meanwhile, we've still got several thousand hostile Indians to contend with and a whole nation to the south that don't like us one bit. It's a poor performance, I say." "Well, at least he was with Famous Shoes," Gus pointed out. "I expect Famous Shoes will guide him home." Governor Pease was staring out the window at the Skull Mansion, its strange turrets just visible above the trees along Shoal Creek. "I'm the governor, but the rich Yankee son of a bitch has never answered to me, that I recall," the governor said. "Every time I call him in for a report, that Yankee nose of his goes up. But that ain't the worst of it. The worst is that he's left us Inez." I expect we can hold our own with the Comanches, and I believe we can whip back the Mexicans, but the heavens are going to ring when Inez Skull finds out that her husband didn't care to come home." Neither Call nor Augustus knew what to say about that. "She's richer than Inez, you know," Governor Pease said. "They're quite a couple, the Skulls, a Yankee snob and a Southern slut. They're hell to manage, both of them." The governor stared glumly out the window for a while. The fact that the two young rangers were still in his office seemed to slip his mind. Below him he could see Bingham sitting in the buggy waiting to take someone somewhere. But it was not until his reverie ended and he saw the two dusty young rangers standing by his desk that he realized Bingham was waiting for them. "Why, gentlemen, excuse me. You'll think I'm daft," Governor Pease said. "Inez Skull used good judgment in making you captains, and I'll second it. You've both got a bright future if you can keep your hair." He had given the young rangers a careful looking over. They were polite in deportment, unlike their commander, the wild millionaire soldier who had just marched off into the wilderness for reasons of his own. Governor Pease was suddenly moved to emotion at the sight of such sturdy, upright young fellows. "You're the future of Texas, fine young men like yourselves," he said. "Why, either of you could wind up governor before you're done if you apply yourselves diligently and keep to the straight and narrow." He patted them both on the shoulder and gave them a warm handshake before sending them away. Augustus claimed the man had even had tears in his eyes. "I didn't see any tears," Call said when they were in the buggy again, heading back down the hill toward the ranger corrals. "Why would he cry if he likes us so much?" "I don't know, and it don't matter. We're captains now, Woodrow," Augustus said. "You heard the governor. He said we're the future of Texas." "I heard him," Call said. "I just don't know what he meant." "Why, it means we're fine fellas," Augustus said. "How would he know that?" Call asked. "He's never even seen us before today." "Now, Woodrow, don't be contrary," Gus said. "He's the governor, and a governor can figure things out quicker than other folks. If he says we're the future of Texas, then I expect it's so." "I ain't being contrary," Call said. "But I still don't know what he meant." When Slipping Weasel came racing into camp with the news that Kicking Wolf had stolen the buffalo horse, there was an uproar at what a big joke it was on the Texans. Old Slow Tree was still there, talking to anyone who would listen about how the time for war with the Texans was over, how it was time for the people to grow corn, how the buffalo would soon disappear so that the people would starve if they did not soon learn the ways of the whites and plant and reap. Buffalo Hump had started avoiding the old chief whenever he could do so without giving offense. When Slipping Weasel came into camp, Buffalo Hump was boiling a buffalo skull in a big pot he had taken from a white farm on the Trinity River. Boiling the skull was taking a long time. Buffalo Hump had to send Lark off several times to gather more firewood. He was boiling the skull because he wanted to make himself a new shield, and he needed the thickest part of the bone for the center of his shield. Very few warriors bothered to make bone shields anymore. It was slow work. And yet only the thickest part of the buffalo skull would turn back a rifle bullet. He had been fortunate enough to kill a bull buffalo with an exceptionally large head. The buffalo had been watering in the Blue River when Buffalo Hump saw him. He had driven the bull into deep water and killed him with an arrow. Then he took the head and carried it all the way back to Texas, despite the flies and the smell, so he could boil it properly and make his shield. The skull was the thickest Buffalo Hump had seen in a long life of hunting. It was so thick that it would turn away any bullet, even one fired at point-blank range. It was important to him that he make the shield correctly. It would not be a very large shield, but it would protect him during the years he had left to raid. All over camp, the warriors were whooping and dancing because of the news Slipping Weasel had brought. It had been poor hunting lately, mainly because old Slow Tree was too lazy to go back to his own hunting ground. The game in the Big Canyon was exhausted. Naturally, the news about Kicking Wolf's audacious theft cheered the young men up. Many of them wondered why it had not occurred to them to steal the buffalo horse. If they ate him, they would not have to hunt so hard for a while. Buffalo Hump thought it was a good joke, too, but he did not allow the news to distract him from the task at hand, which was to fashion the best possible shield from the great head he had taken on the Blue River, far north of his usual hunting range. When Slipping Weasel came over to sit with Buffalo Hump for a while, Buffalo Hump was skimming the broth from the boiling pot and drinking it. In the broth, as in the shield, was the strength of the buffalo people. He gave Slipping Weasel a cup of the broth, but Slipping Weasel, a poor hunter and indifferent fighter, did not like it much. "It has too many hairs in it," he told Buffalo Hump, who thought the comment ridiculous. It was the skull of a buffalo. Of course the broth had hairs in it. "Where is he taking the buffalo horse?" he asked. "Why didn't he bring him here so we could eat him?" Slipping Weasel was silent for a while, mainly because he didn't know what to answer. He had met a Kiowa medicine man on his ride back, and the Kiowa told him that the news was that Kicking Wolf meant to take the big horse to Mexico and sell him to the black vaquero. Slipping Weasel did not really believe such a tale, since the black vaquero hated all Indians, as Kicking Wolf well knew. Buffalo Hump might not believe the story either, but it was the only explanation Slipping Weasel had to offer. "They say he is taking the horse to Mexico. He wants to sell him to the black vaquero," he said finally. Buffalo Hump didn't take that information very seriously. "If he gets there, Ahumado will boil him like I am boiling the skull," he said. Then Slipping Weasel remembered an even more surprising thing he had heard from Straight Elbow, the old Kiowa. Straight Elbow got his name because he had never been able to bend his right arm, as a consequence of which he could not hunt well. Straight Elbow had to live on roots and acorns like a squirrel. He searched constantly for herbs or medicines that might allow him to straighten his arm, but he never found the right medicine. "Old Straight Elbow told me something else," Slipping Weasel admitted. "He said Big Horse Skull is following Kicking Wolf. Famous Shoes is with him, and they are both walking." Buffalo Hump agreed that that was out of the ordinary. Once there had been whites who walked everywhere, but most of the old walking whites were dead. Now the soldiers and rangers were always mounted. He went on boiling his skull. What he heard seemed like a crazy business. Kicking Wolf and Skull were both doing crazy things. Of course, old Straight Elbow was crazy himself. There might be no truth in what he said. Buffalo Hump, though, made no comment. He had reached the age where time was beginning to seem short. He wanted to devote all his thought to his own plans, and plans he thought he should make for his people. A few years before, when the shitting sickness struck the people, the cholera, the Comanches had died so fast that he thought the end of the people had come. Then the smallpox came and killed more people, sometimes half the people in a given band. These plagues came from the air. None of the medicine men were wise enough to cure them. He himself had gone on several vigils, but his vigils had had no effect on the plague. Still, though many died, some lived. The Comanches were not as powerful a tribe as they had been, but there was still no one on the plains who could oppose them. They could still beat the whites back, slipping between the forts to attack farms and ranches. The white soldiers were not yet bold enough to attack them on the llano where they lived. Slow Tree, though boring, was not foolish. He saw what any man of sense could see, that it was the whites, not the people, who were growing more numerous. It would take many years for the young women to bear enough babies to bring the strength of the people back to what it had been before the coming of the plagues. But the whites had not suffered much from the plagues. For every white that died, 3 arrived to take his place. The whites came from far places, from lands no Comanche had ever seen. Like ants, they worked their way up the rivers into the Comanche lands. Soon there would be so many that no chief could hope to kill them all in war or drive them away. Slow Tree was right about the buffalo, too. Every year there were fewer of them. Each fall the hunters had to range farther, and even so they came back with less. Now there were signs that the blue-coat soldiers meant to come into the field against them. Soon an army might come, not just the few rangers who followed them and tried to take back captives or stolen horses. The rangers were too few to attack them in their camps, but the soldiers were not too few, for now the soldiers were only parading. But someday they would come. Buffalo Hump saw what Slow Tree saw, but he did not intend to let the whites control him. He had never broken the earth to raise anything, and he did not intend to. It was fine for Kicking Wolf to steal the buffalo horse, but that was only a joke, though a bold joke. What Buffalo Hump wanted was a great raid, A great raid, such as there had been in the past, when warriors went into even the largest towns and stole captives or burned buildings or ran off all the horses and livestock that they wanted. Once he himself had raided all the way to the Great Water, coming back with so many horses that they filled the plains like buffalo. The great raids had scared the Texans so badly that they were eager for councils and treaties. They made the Comanches many promises and gave them small gifts in hopes that they would not raid all the towns and scare the new white people away. Buffalo Hump wanted to launch a great raid again, a raid with hundreds of warriors into Austin and San Antonio. They would kill many Texans, take many captives, and take what booty they wanted. Such a raid would show the Texans that the Comanches were still a people to be feared. Again, they would call for councils and treaties. He himself did not believe in councils or treaties, but old Slow Tree could go. He loved to parley with the whites. He would sit under a tent for weeks, boring the whites with his long speeches. Meanwhile, on the plains, the young women would be having babies, bringing a new generation of warriors to replace the ones lost to the plagues. A great raid would remind the Texans that the Comanches were a people still. They could not be turned into farmers just because the whites wanted their land. Buffalo Hump wanted to launch such a great raid, and he wanted to do it soon, with all the warriors he could persuade to accompany him, from his band and Slow Tree's and the others. He wanted to make the raid soon, while the north wind was still sharp as a knife, while the snows fell and the sleet cut down. Never before had the Comanches made a raid in the coldest month of the winter. Whites and Mexicans both, but particularly Mexicans, had come to fear the fall when the great yellow harvest moon shone. Along the old war trail, the moon of the fall was called the Comanche Moon. For longer than anyone could remember, it had been under the generous light of the fall moon that the Comanches had struck deep into Mexico to kill and loot and bring back captives. For most of his life, Buffalo Hump had kept to the traditional ways. Like his father and grandfather before him, he had followed the great Comanche war trail into Mexico in the fall. When he first raided to the Great Water, his ferocity had driven whole villages to throw themselves into the sea. Those who could not drown themselves were pulled out like fishes for rape or torture. The captives he had taken would fill a town, and for every captive taken, 2 or 3 Mexicans lay dead in their villages or fields. But since the plague struck, Buffalo Hump had not raided much. With the game so thin, it was hard work just to keep food in the cookpots. He had not had time to follow the great yellow moon into Mexico. Now the Mexicans were better armed than they had ever been. Often they fought back, and it was pointless to go into the territory of Ahumado. He was Indio too and could not be cowed. Besides, he had drained the villages of their wealth and himself had taken all the captives worth having. Often now, at night, Buffalo Hump climbed up high onto a spur of rock near the edge of the great canyon to sing and pray and seek instruction from the spirits. With his heavy hump, it was hard to climb the spur, but Buffalo Hump did it, night after night, for the matters he prayed about were serious. He felt it was time to raid. The high, cold moon that sailed over the canyon in February was as much a Comanche moon as the fat moon of the fall. He knew that most warriors, and many chiefs too, would want to wait until fall to start the great raid, but Buffalo Hump felt strongly that the raid ought to be pressed now, as soon as stores could be got ready. South of them, in the forts along the rivers, blue-coat soldiers were training. There were many of them near the Phantom Hill. In the spring the soldiers might do what they had not yet done, come north and attack them in their camps. If the soldiers fought well and killed too many warriors, the Comanches' pride might be broken forever. Instead of following the way of free Comanches, the way of the arrow and the lance, they might begin to accept the counsel of Slow Tree, which was the counsel of defeat. Buffalo Hump wanted to strike before any of that happened. He did not want to wait in the hope that the white soldiers would leave them alone for another season. The people had never waited to be led into war by the whites. Always they had taken war to the whites, and they would do so again. So, night after night, Buffalo Hump climbed to the high rock and prayed for instruction. He was not a fool. He knew that the whites were stronger now. They were more numerous than the Comanche and better armed. That was why he wanted to strike in winter. The soldiers were inside their forts trying to keep warm. So were the farmers and the people of the towns. They would not expect hundreds of warriors to slash down on them like sleet. Yet he knew that even so, the whites might win. Every time he went into the Brazos country, he was shocked to see the whites filling it in such numbers. Always, too, their guns improved. They had rifles now that could spit many bullets and strike warriors fatally at ranges well beyond that of any arrow. Armed with their new guns, the whites might win. He and all the chiefs might fall in battle, in which case the day of the Comanche people would be over. If the great raid failed and the strongest chiefs were killed, then there would be no recovery for the people, and the wisdom of Slow Tree would be the wisdom that would have to prevail. Sitting on the rock every night, in wind or sleet or snow, Buffalo Hump did not see defeat in his visions. Instead, he saw the houses of the white men burning, their women killed, their children taken from them. He saw himself as he had been when young, leading his warriors into towns and villages, bursting into farmhouses and killing the whites where they stood. He saw his warriors coming back north with a great herd of livestock, enough to cover the plains where the buffalo had been. He had not yet called a council of the braves because every night his vision grew stronger. In his vision he saw 1,000 warriors riding together in war paint, wearing all the finery they could assemble, sweeping down on the white towns, singing their war songs, killing whites, and burning settlements all the way to the Great Water. Slipping Weasel was disappointed by Buffalo Hump's casual response to his news. The whole camp was excited about it, but Buffalo Hump was barely moved to comment. Of course, Buffalo Hump and Kicking Wolf were old rivals and often quarreled. Maybe Buffalo Hump was glad that Kicking Wolf had left. "You could go catch Skull," Slipping Weasel suggested. "He is walking not far from the Pecos. You could catch him in a few days." "Am I a rabbit hunter?" Buffalo Hump said. "Skull is just a rabbit. Let him hop down to Mexico. The black vaquero will catch him and make a tree grow through him." He was referring to a strange torture that the black vaquero sometimes inflicted on his enemies if he caught them alive. He would trim the leaves and limbs off a small, slim tree and then sharpen the bowl to a fine point. Then he would strip his enemy and lift him up and lower him onto the sharp point of the skinned tree. The man's weight would carry him downward so that the tree went higher and higher into his body. Ahumado was an expert at the torture. He would spend an hour or more sitting a man on the sharp tree so that as the tree passed through his body it would not pierce any vital organs and allow the man to die too easily. Sometimes the slim trees would pass all the way through the captive's body and poke out behind his body, and yet he would still be living and suffering. Once Slipping Weasel and Buffalo Hump and a few warriors had come upon a little forest of such trees, with men stuck on them like rotting fruit. There were more than 10 in all, and 2 of the men were still alive, panting hoarsely and crying for water. It had been a startling sight, the little forest of trees with men hanging on them like fruit. The Comanches had lingered by the forest of tree-stuck men for half a day, studying the dead men and the living. The living men were in such agony that even the slightest touch made them scream with pain. Buffalo Hump and the other Comanches were surprised by the sight. They did not often see tortures that were worse than their own. All the way back to the plains they talked about the torture of the little trees. On the way home they surprised a few Texans driving a horse herd west. They wanted to catch one of the Texans and stick him on a little tree to learn the technique. But the Texans fought so fiercely that they had to kill them all, and did not get to practice the little tree torture. Those who had seen the forest of dead and dying men did not forget it, though. None of them after that were eager to go into Ahumado's country. Slipping Weasel finally got up and left Buffalo Hump alone, since the chief seemed to be in a bad mood and had little to say. More and more Buffalo Hump spent his days with his young wife, Lark. Once, when they were engaged with one another, they forgot themselves to such an extent that they rolled out from under their tent and coupled for a brief time in full view of some old women who were scraping a buffalo hide. The old women were agitated by the sight. They tittered about it for days. Buffalo Hump's other wives did not appreciate the tittering. A day or 2 later they found an excuse to beat Lark, and they beat her soundly. Slipping Weasel thought he could find a few warriors who would want to go catch Big Horse Skull, But when he tried to talk some warriors into going, they all made excuses and put him off. The reason was Buffalo Hump. Everyone knew that the chief was planning something. They saw him leave the camp night after night to climb a rock far up the canyon where he prayed and sang. Except for Lark, he paid little attention to anyone. He only wanted to copulate with Lark or sit on his rock praying. Everyone knew that he was seeking visions. Old Slow Tree had finally left the camp in annoyance because Buffalo Hump was so uninterested in his notions of how to get along with the whites. What the warriors thought was that Buffalo Hump would soon find his vision and call them all to war. Earlier, they would have been glad to track down Big Horse Skull and take revenge on him, but now they were afraid to leave, for fear that they would not be there when Buffalo Hump called them to the war trail. Old Slow Tree's warriors did not much want to go away with him. They didn't share his peaceful views and were eager to fight the whites again. Though it annoyed him, Slipping Weasel had to abandon his plan for catching Big Horse Skull. He waited, as the others waited, doing a little hunting but mainly looking to his weapons. He and the other warriors spent many days making arrows, sharpening their points, smoothing their stems. They rewrapped the heads of their lances and made sure their buffalo skin shields were taut. Then one day Buffalo Hump finished boiling the great skull he had brought back from the Blue River. All day he worked to make the hard part into a small, heavy shield, much heavier than the skin shields the other warriors carried. At dusk, when he finished the shield, he went out to the horse herd and brought back the strong white gelding he rode when he went raiding. That night he kept the horse tethered behind his tent. It was late in the night when he came out of his tent and walked back up the canyon to the high rock. He wore nothing that night but a loincloth, and he carried his bow and his new shield. All night they heard Buffalo Hump praying. Once the sun edged into the sky and light came to the canyon, Buffalo Hump was still sitting on the high rock with his bow and his thick shield. When he walked back into the camp with the sun well up, there was a hush in the camp. The women didn't talk of copulating as they worked at the cooking pots, as was common in the morning. The hush silenced the children. They didn't run and play. The dogs ceased barking. Everyone knew that Buffalo Hump had found his vision. When he sat down in front of his tent and began to paint himself for war, there was joy throughout the camp. Within a few minutes he sent runners to call the warriors from the other bands. Solemnly but gladly, all the warriors began to do as their chief was doing. They began to put on war paint. No one asked Buffalo Hump what he was planning. No one needed to. There would be a great raid on the whites. Comanche warriors would be proud men again. The endless talk about whether to grow corn was over. Their greatest chief had found a vision, and it was not a vision of peace. By afternoon, warriors from the nearby bands began to ride in, painted and ready. There was much selecting of horses and packing of stores. The women worked hard, but their voices were hushed. They did not want to be joking when their men were going on a raid that might mean glory or might mean death. Finally, one old warrior, Old Crooked Hawk, known for his great curiosity but not for his good judgment, had the temerity to ask Buffalo Hump how far he planned to raid. Buffalo Hump did not look at the old man. He wanted to concentrate on his vision of burning houses. Anyway, he did not know how far he planned to raid. He would raid until it was time to quit. But as he was about to answer the old man brusquely, he saw in his mind another vision, this one of the sea. The great water rolled toward the land and spat from its depths the bodies of whites. The vision of the sea with the white bodies bobbing in it was so powerful that Buffalo Hump realized he ought to be grateful to Crooked Hawk for asking the question that had enabled him to see the final part of his vision. The vision of rolling waves spitting white bodies onto beaches of sand. The vision was so strong that Buffalo Hump stood up and yelled at the warriors loudly, his voice echoing off the canyon. "The Great Water!" he yelled. "We are going to the Great Water, and we are going now!" 600 braves rode out of the canyon behind him, the sun glinting on their lances. When sound came back to the camp, it was the sound women make, talking to one another as they cooked and did chores. A few babies cried, a few dogs barked. The old men smoked. By the time the moon rose, Buffalo Hump and his warriors were already miles to the south.